Hello everyone, my name is Jacob Snow, lead designer of Legends of Albadyn, and I'm here today to bring you the first episode in hopefully a relatively long series about the fundamentals of game design. As this is our first episode, we will begin focusing on we will begin by focusing on one of the most important and indeed arguably the first step of game design, which is answering the question, what type of game is this? If you are a fledgling, aspiring, or indeed returning tabletop game designer, or game designer in general, you have likely found yourself asking this question a couple of times in the past. And as a question, it is both extremely easy and extremely difficult to answer, dependent upon your level of experience, as well as how many ideas you happen to have bouncing around at the time you ask the question. And if you're anything like me, the more ideas you have, the harder this question is to answer. Fortunately, I'm here to help. And I'm going to help in every way I can. And it's going to be awesome. You're going to rock at this, so just buckle up and we're going to have a grand old time. So we're going to answer this question in two different steps. Step one will be answering the type of the game. The genre, the overarching style of the game. And the second question we'll be answering is, what is the medium/tone that we are looking for? This video is not exhaustive. It's important to note this, just because this video focuses on a set number of styles and examples and mediums that you can use for game design and gameplay, does not mean there are not infinitely more out there. But for the purpose of time and based upon the knowledge that I currently possess, we are going to focus on broad strokes for right now, on limiting the amount of information so new designers don't get overloaded. So on to step one, competitive or cooperative. This question arguably needs to be the first step in terms of game design. Do you want your players to be working against other players, or do you want your players to be working together against a common enemy, which is more situational or narrative driven in nature? Competitive games, for example, are games like Warhammer 40k, Battletech, Exploding Kittens. Games in which players are present at the table for the purpose of defeating other players, and the win condition / end goal of the game is for there to be one player or one team left standing and all other players / teams left in the dust behind them. Competitive games are relatively common. They are a lot of fun to design, with an emphasis on game balance and on replayability, as competitive games are player versus player. If you do not have a high degree of replayability, you will find yourself struggling to maintain a player base. As such, competitive games can be a lot of fun to design and a lot of fun to play, but they also tend to require a fair bit of maintenance, as is seen by the now 9 editions of Warhammer 40k and the multiple iterations of Battletech. Competitive games are not extremely difficult to design, but good competitive games require a lot of testing and often a lot of iterations, as things that made sense during testing stop making sense in the broader player base's hands. Cooperative games, such as Dungeons and Dragons, Arkham Horror, there aren't a lot of them, as is evidenced by my relative inexperience in terms of which games are cooperative and which games are not. Dungeons and Dragons is the primary example of this, however, which is why it's the art that is on the cover of the 5th edition Player's Handbook was chosen for this, and I believe it's the Player's Handbook, but don't hold me to that. Was chosen to be the face of cooperative gaming. While competitive gaming is focused on elimination of other players and on completion of victory objectives that allow a single player or single team to win over other players or teams, cooperative games feature a team of players struggling to survive against a common threat or enemy. In Dungeons & Dragons, this is whatever is put forward by the campaign. In Arkham Horror, it's eldritch monstrosities and scenarios far beyond the real, and in Legends of Albadyn, it's whatever monsters the director happens to have on hand for the session. While cooperative games are easier in some ways to create than competitive games, in other ways they are more difficult as well. With a competitive game, the end goal is simple. One player wins. With a cooperative game, however, you have to generate replayability not in terms of scale or in terms of factions or what have you. Your replayability is generated in terms of breadth of content and in interests generated by the win condition. Cooperative games are a lot of fun to make. I speak from experience on that one. But they do require a fair deal of testing and a fair bit of reiteration throughout the design process. With that being said, I encourage you, at this point in the video, to pause the video for a moment, contemplate on what we've just talked about, and with a notebook or a Word document or a Post-it note, write down what type of game you think the world needs more of. Do you think the world needs more cooperative games or more competitive games? This is arguably the most important step in your game design journey, as you have now set the tone for the entire design process by choosing whether you're going to be competitive, cooperative, or in some cases a mixture of both. You now have a course more or less charted, if not set. Because with this information in mind, you know what types you will know what types of rules you need to be making, what type of balancing decisions you need to be making, and how you need to progress in terms of your design moving forward. That's what the purpose of this series of videos is to help you answer those questions when we get to them. The next step that we will be addressing is the choice of type and medium. What kind of game are you going to create now that you know if it's going to be cooperative or competitive? The type speaks to, is it going to be with miniatures moving across abstract or fixed space? Is it going to be a card game? If a card game, what kind of card game? That's where we're going next. Again, it's important to emphasize this is broad strokes, not this is what it is, take it or leave it. There are nearly infinite permutations of how you can design your game. So the first type and medium of game that we're going to be looking at is miniature gaming. This is seen with Warhammer, with Battletech, with Dungeons and Dragons, depending on the table that you're at, with Gloomhaven. Miniatures are utilized to represent either forces under the player's control or indeed the player's specific character, and they move across space, be it measured by inches or measured by squares. With miniature gaming, there are two different families, if you will. One is the fixed speed, which is units/players always move X amount. A great example of this is with Warhammer or with Battletech. The speed of the unit is a fixed interval. For instance, your average Chaos Space Marine can move 6 inches, I believe. I haven't played since 8th edition. Whereas a vehicle can move 12, 24, even more inches than that. And with Battletech, you choose your movement speed. So, for instance, an Atlas can move 2 spaces, 3 spaces, or 4 spaces, just depending on what you've got your settings set to. If, however, you elect to not just use spaces or inches or fixed movement, that brings us to our second type of medium. And miniatures aren't always seen with this, but they often are. And that is your standard dyed-in-the-wool board game. Okay, this is a game like Monopoly or like Sorry, where there's a fixed amount of spaces, often in a pattern, so it's more like a racetrack than a interlinear battlefield. With board games over just miniature games in general, the play space is fixed. It's not a wide open area. It's a set area. That's what makes it a board game, is the fact that there's a board. If this is the type of game that you elect to design, more effort will be passed on to you as the designer, and less effort will be passed on to the end user. Ask anyone who's playing Battletech or Warhammer what one of the more enjoyable but also lengthy parts of the process is. You will probably hear at least 3 or 4 players complain about setting up the terrain and setting up the table. This takes time because there's no fixed rules on how you're supposed to do it, albeit with Warhammer there are fixed rules, but they're not at the same time. With a board game, it's simple. Open box, get out board, flop, done. And that's pretty darn appealing. From my personal experience, when I've had boards that I used for Legends of Albadyn or for other projects that I was working on, gameplay got started a lot faster, which is something that's important to remember as you continue answering the question of what type of game are you making. One thing that is in common, however, between both board games and miniature games is the fact that you are moving a model through space, whether it is linear space, as seen with Monopoly, or infinitely reconfigurable space, as you see with games like Warhammer and Battletech. You're still moving a figurine or a meeple or what have you through spaces. The second broad type of game and next medium that we'll be looking at, however, doesn't usually feature movement, although it can in rare instances, and that is card games. That's right. We've now entered the domain that some people might not count as tabletop games, but it's honestly, at least from my perspective, it's a game that I have to have a tabletop to play, so it's a tabletop game. Card games are widely variant, although just from my personal experience, I can't say that I've ever seen a cooperative card game. If you've ever seen one, please post it in the links in the comments below, because I would love to learn more about that. Card games don't usually feature movement, and they feature cards. I mean, it's a card game. The tone of the game, however, can be trading card game, which encourages you to exchange cards with other players or at your local store to get more cards that are more powerful, build decks based on archetypes or colors or energy types. The list goes on. That's the trading card game. Whereas you also have collector card games in which you're just trying to acquire cards, not necessarily exchange them. I don't have as much experience with collector card games, so I can't really talk on it that much. And then you have my personal favorite of them, party card games. These games are like Cards Against Humanity or Exploding Kittens, and they don't feature much movement of cards. They're like basically the board game of card gaming. Very linear rules, not a lot of deck building or anything like that. It's just open the box, get out the cards, shuffle them, play. When it comes to card games, there are benefits and drawbacks, similar to miniatures and board games, etc. The benefits of a card game is that you don't have to fiddle with a movement system, whether it's rolling dice or inch movement or space movement. It's just a moot point unless you're deciding to be really adventurous and make a card game with movement base, which, hey, I like your cut, G, but that may not be the best idea if you're just starting out. Card games do feature a little bit of difficulty in terms of, firstly, it has to make sense, and secondly, it does have a certain cosmetic requirement. And all tabletop games have a cosmetic requirement. Don't worry about it yet. We get there when we get there. The primary drawback for card games, however, and this is something that I have personal experience with, is that balancing them out is very difficult. While balancing for miniature games or board games is a little difficult as well, I have seen more consistent balancing issues with card games than I have with anything in particular. A grand example of this is the My Hero Academia card game made by Funimation. It's a really fun game, but the balancing makes zero sense whatsoever, and it really detracts from your fun when you're playing it. So if you're going to make a card game, bear in mind that down the road when we do the video on balancing, you're going to have a lot to think about in terms of how does this work. These basics, these fundamentals of game design, if you will, are the first step that you're really taking here on your journey of game design. And with this first step out of the way, with the knowledge required to really take this first step, you are already on the road to becoming a tabletop game designer. And it is awesome, and it is exciting, and it is a wonderful thing. Throughout this series, which I intend to upload at least once a month, I'm a busy guy, what can I say? I will give you the tips and tricks that I have learned both from personal game design and from experiences that I have heard other designers had. I may even feature other designers in this series. I'm super excited to be working on this and super excited to be guiding you, the next generation of tabletop game design, regardless of age, regardless of gender, regardless of sexual orientation. You are amazing, and you are what is going to keep the tabletop gaming space alive in the years to come. We're waiting for you. We're really excited to show you the path to get here, and I cannot wait to see what you create. As I stated at the beginning of the video, my name is Jacob Snow, and I look forward to seeing you in our next tabletop game design fundamentals video. Until next we meet, may your journey continue.